So, here's the billion-dollar question. How do we actually tackle greenhouse gas emissions without bringing our economy to a screeching halt? It's a huge challenge, right? But what if the solution wasn't just about making more rules, but about economics? What if we could put a price on pollution itself? Well, that's the powerful idea we're diving into today.
And really, it all boils down to this one central question. Should we take a top-down approach, with the government giving orders on exactly who has to cut emissions and how they have to do it, or can we harness the power of the market to find the cheapest, smartest, most efficient way to clean up our act?
So to figure that out, here's our game plan. We're going to start by comparing two competing policies. Then we'll break down how cap and trade actually works. After that, we'll see it in action in the real world, explore the different kinds of carbon markets out there, and finally ask the big question, is this the ultimate solution?
All right, first up, let's look at that fundamental choice. When it comes to tackling pollution, there are really two completely different philosophies we can follow.
On one hand, you've got the classic command and control approach. It's super direct. A regulator tells a factory, you must install this specific filter, or you have to cut your emissions by this exact amount. But on the other hand, you've got a market-based approach, like cap and trade. This one doesn't give orders. Instead, it creates financial incentives and basically lets businesses figure out the smartest way to reach the goal.
Okay, so that leads us right into cap and trade. The name itself is actually a perfect description of how it works, and it breaks down into two really simple but powerful ideas. First, you've got the cap. Now, this is the part that guarantees the environmental outcome. A government or a regulator looks at a whole sector, let's say electricity generation, and sets a firm, declining limit, or a cap, on the total amount of pollution allowed. It's a hard ceiling. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now for the really clever part, the trade. The government issues permits, or allowances, that all add up to the total cap. Each one of these allowances lets a company emit 1 ton of CO2. So if a company finds a cheap and easy way to cut its pollution, it suddenly has leftover allowances it can sell. And a company that finds it really expensive to cut emissions, well, it can just buy those extras instead. And just like that, you've created a market out of thin air.
Theory is one thing, but let's make this real. Imagine two polluters. Emitter A is an old power plant, and emitter B is a modern factory. The government's goal is to cut their combined pollution by 300 tons. Simple enough.
Now, using that old command and control method, a regulator might just say, easy, you each cut 150 tons. But here's the problem. Not all cuts are created equal. Maybe emitter A has older technology, making it incredibly expensive for them to reduce their emissions. We're talking $5,000. Meanwhile, emitter B can do it for just $1,000.
So, we hit our environmental target, sure, but look at the cost. A combined $6,000. That's our baseline. Now let's see if the market can do any better.
Okay, now let's introduce the market. With cap and trade, emitter B, the one who can cut pollution cheaply, realizes, hey, I can make extra cuts and it won't cost me much, so it does more of the work. Emitter A can now make fewer of its really expensive cuts and just buy the extra allowances it needs from emitter B. See? Both companies win. And this is the payoff. We get the exact same environmental result, that 300-ton reduction, but the total cost drops to just $4,500. That's a 25% savings. And it wasn't achieved by some new technology, but simply by letting the market find the smartest, cheapest path. That was a pretty simple example, of course. So how does this whole thing work in the real world? Well, let's look at the biggest, baddest cap and trade system on the planet, the European Union's emissions trading system, or as it's often called, the EU ETS. And the scale here is just massive. The EU ETS covers around 10,000 different facilities, power plants, factories, even airlines. And it accounts for a staggering 40% of the EU's total greenhouse gas emissions. You know, this system didn't just appear overnight. It's been evolving for nearly 2 decades. It started as a pilot, then it moved to a phase where most of the allowances were just given away for free. Since then, it shifted to a system where auctioning, actually making polluters pay, is a core principle. And each phase has gotten more ambitious, with that cap on emissions getting tighter and tighter every year. But real-world markets are messy, and the price of pollution is definitely not stable. For example, when the war in Ukraine began back in 2022, the price of an allowance plummeted by nearly 40% in just 2 weeks. Why? Well, fears of an economic slowdown made investors think that the demand for energy, and therefore emissions, was about to fall. And this kind of volatility, well, it really sparked some intense political debate.
Here you have the former Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš arguing that flawed rules and speculation, people just buying allowances to bet on future price changes, were driving prices totally out of control and making electricity more expensive for everyone.
And then, a year later, the Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki echoed that exact same concern, saying the price was directly hurting household budgets. It really highlights the court tension of any carbon price, doesn't it? How do you make pollution expensive enough to stop without creating a ton of economic pain in the process?
Now, it's super important to know that the EU ETS is what's called a compliance market, which means it's mandatory. But it's not the only type of carbon market out there. There's a whole other category that we need to understand.
So let's break down the two types. You've got compliance markets like the EU's, which are mandatory. You participate because the law says you have to. Then you have voluntary markets, and they are exactly what they sound like. Companies choose to buy carbon credits, usually to meet their own corporate social responsibility goals or those self-imposed net zero targets. And as you can see, everything from the motivation to the oversight is completely different between the two.
So, we've seen the theory, and we've seen the messy reality of cap and trade. This brings us to the final and most crucial question. Is this thing the silver bullet for climate change?
And the expert consensus on this is pretty darn clear. According to the World Resources Institute, putting a price on carbon is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient. It's a critical tool, maybe even the cornerstone of our policy house, but it can't be the entire building. Other complementary policies are totally essential.
And here's the why behind that. A carbon price has a tough time covering certain sectors, like agriculture. It can't always overcome other market barriers, and frankly, it isn't always enough to spark the invention of truly breakthrough technologies. The takeaway is clear. A carbon price is a powerful tool, but what we really need is an entire toolbox.
In the end, cap and trade is a powerful, elegant idea. It forces us to confront the real cost of pollution by putting a price tag right on it. But that leads to a much bigger question, doesn't it? We can calculate the price of a ton of carbon, but what is the true value of the clean, stable, and sustainable future that we're all trying to build?